Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our session on transformations, organizations, and initiatives. So our plan for this session is to have, I'm going to make a brief introduction, and then we're going to go to our three panelists. We're going to give them an opportunity to talk to us about their transformations initiatives and organizations. And then we're going to have a facilitated dialogue with the panel. After that, we're going to have breakouts that Ioan Fazey is going to facilitate at each table. And we'll also have a separate breakouts online for our online participants, as well as for our panelists. Then we'll come back together and we'll do the individual tables will share an insight from their discussion. And then we'll have feedback that Ioan is going to facilitate from the audience. And we'll also get some insight on these questions from the panelists themselves. And we'll finish with a question, and that'll be it. And so let's just dive right in. So this panel aims to build a conversation about transformations initiatives. So in my introduction, I mentioned that we are really interested in the way that transformations practitioners build, design, manage, facilitate, and support transformations initiatives, because often conventional institutions, organizations don't serve our needs as transformations professionals. So we've invited three people who we believe are engaged in that process of providing leadership in the design, management, facilitation, and support of transformations initiatives to share their insights about what that's been like as transformations professionals. So the aim is to get us thinking about this strange entity that we're calling the Transformations Initiative, get a sense of what makes it different from what we're calling a conventional institution. And reflect back on what Ioan was talking about earlier in his presentation about transformation, what it means, how it's a different form of change, and how it reflects not only transformation of the system, but transformation of the self. So this conversation among people who are in different organizations, but all seem to have this element of transformative capacity building, is kind of a laying the groundwork for the remainder of our discussion throughout these afternoon sessions about transformations initiatives. We just want to get a feel for these organizations. What are they? What makes them transformative? What are some of the insights that people who lead them have about how to design, structure, and implement them? What are some of the challenges they face in creating them? Creating organizations that are oriented toward a better future, but need to live in the present, and need to be funded in the present. And how can we overcome those challenges? So we have three panelists. Derk Loorbach is online. He is the director of Drift. Carvalho is right here. She is the activator of the Global Regeneration Collab. And then Ramphele is here as well. She's with the Club of Rome, and she's also the founder of a group called Reimagine SA. I'll leave it to them to give you a sense of what their institutions, what their transformations initiatives are in their introductions. So we'll begin we'll go to each panelist and we'll ask them a simple question. Tell us about your transformations initiatives that you've been involved in and your experience with them. This is just a short, maybe 3-minute presentation for each, just to get us going. And why don't we begin with Derk Loorbach.
Yes, thanks, Bruce. Good afternoon or good day, good morning, wherever you are. Great to join, unfortunately online, but hopefully that works out. I'm a professor of socioeconomic transitions at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and I direct Drift, which is a social enterprise of the university. I'll come to that. But my background is very undisciplinary. So I studied culture and science in the 1990s when the end of history was declared and postmodernism and post-normal science entered the scene. I studied in Maastricht, which is a problem-based education university. And when I came out of the university, I ended up in an emerging field of sustainability transitions research that then started in the Netherlands. And there's this whole big concept of systemic change on the long term, and I was sort of given the task, think about what it means for agency and for strategy. And what evolved in my personal professional journey is that we took this idea of radical system change on the long term as a big concept to help people in their everyday context find the steps that hold the most transformative potential. So I also personally theorize about transformations and transformative potential. We are always talking about transitions in the making that are in the future. And one of the key ingredients we find is that most people assume the future to be a very incremental, gradual extension of the present, or something that is fearful and about collapse and something. Either way, it's perpetuating business as usual, or it's making people afraid of the future. The transition thinking is also a tool to make people open up to the potential of radical systems change. On the one hand, the inevitability. We are in an unsustainable, unjust global economy, which will be disrupted and which will be pushed out of equilibrium. But that out of equilibrium state is also through which we can find completely unimaginable or unthinkable futures in a relatively short amount of time. So that was very briefly how sort of the core idea of using concepts like transitions, transformation on a big scale to help people go through a problem-based social learning process within their everyday environment, imagining radical alternative futures, and then bringing that down to very specific concrete actions. The initiatives I'm involved in multiple, so we apply this, we do this in a transdisciplinary way in all sorts of areas, levels in society as researchers. But the two initiatives I'm most proud of is Drift, which is a social enterprise, an independent unit of our university that with colleagues, we're 40 people, and we combine academic research with activism, with applied research, consultancy, training, education, basically all around establishing a new transdisciplinary knowledge culture within the university. Over the past 2 years, it finally got some recognition in our university, and I'm now sort of leading a strategic experiment with the transition of the whole university, trying to take that transition frame that I described to bring colleagues together to reflect on the unsustainability and the lock-ins of our current academic system, but also prefigure and experiment with and explore and test ways to create a collaborative, normatively engaged, experimental, and a transformative research environment. And doing that in itself, in this more reflexive, analytical, but also action-oriented learning by doing way, is, I think, how we as researchers or reflexive practitioners can be part of the transformations, and in doing so also influence, hopefully on the long term, where they end up.
Thanks, Derk. Yes, I really get a great sense from what you're saying about how this is a great platform for action research, for moving beyond the confines of academia. So our next speaker will be Carvalho, and she'll be telling us about her work with the Global Regeneration Collab.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure, especially to also share the space with Derk and Mamphela. And I want to tell you mostly about the Global Regeneration Collab. I have a background in ecology, and I was specifically working on network ecology, so studying pollination networks in nature. And after around a year, I had the opportunity to start applying this knowledge to networks of people in the context of regeneration. And that's what I started doing. And I ended up moving out of academia for this. And this main initiative, the Global Regeneration Collab, I would call it a community of practice, but be aware that this is my own description of it as being part of the activation team, because it is a very emergent space, and I bet others would describe it maybe even a little bit differently. So what we do with the Global Regeneration Collab is to hold space for practitioners, people that are working in regeneration around the world, from different countries, from different backgrounds, working even in different fields, to meet and exchange. So there are people working in regenerative agriculture. There are people imagining what a regenerative economy could look like. There are people thinking about how do we bring ideas of regeneration into schools to children. And by having this digital space, so this is purely digital, I should probably mention, people are able to get insights and connect with others and get insights from other disciplines and from other parts of the world of very different contexts that they end up applying. Meeting collaborators, there have been initiatives that have started just because people bumped into each other on a call, on a breakout, and realized that they had a lot more in common and they had shared ideas, and something new is born. So this work of network weaving at this level is a lot, honestly, about holding space for people to come together and also holding infrastructure. So one thing that is very important for us is to allow for emergence and allow for self-organizing. So we decentralize the agency in the network. So there is an activation team that is there to support, let's say, if a group then starts having in a conversation somewhere during a specific session, a group then starts thinking about, oh, we really want to have a conversation about how we can use games to bring ideas of regeneration to schools. We want to start meeting regularly. The activation team is there to support them with the tech infrastructure, how to send out invites. So with these very specific practical things that can help people to just have agency and to start their own things and to run with them freely. And this is a very important point. Just there is sometimes this idea that self-organizing will just happen and things will suddenly we'll have projects and initiatives. And I mean, ideas do appear, but without any kind of support or direction, they many times die. So this is something that we try to do very actively. And then I will actually bring up another initiative that I'm involved in. So we started then looking at, okay, we have the Global Regeneration Collab, but there's also the Deep Adaptation Forum, the Deep Transformations Network. There is also the Complexity Adventures, and they're all adjacent to each other. There's the Regenerative Communities Network, Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and they're all working towards a better future for people and planet. How do we then break those silos even? How do we create that architecture for change where people exchange ideas between different groups, where you have redundancy of transfer of information about new practices, about things that are working in a specific part of the world? So this other initiative would be the FITO network, which is a network of networks. So actively trying to bring together people from different groups to try and break these walls as much as possible. Yes, so, and then there's the element, I would say, a very important one also that I think is present across is the mapping. So how do we even know who is in the room, which ones are the groups? And there's a lot of people trying to figure out how do we share this information. And I would say that would end by saying that there's a lot more people in the world working on this than any of us sitting here imagine, even I that I'm actively working on this every day. And that there are also people wondering how we can use the digital to support in-person connection. How can we bring people together coming from the digital, which is, I think, potentially quite a little bit what's happening right here. And what's happening with some movements such as ReFi, that are starting with the Web3 movement and then converging in person, bringing together regenerators, technologists, investors towards new potential, breaking all these silos. Okay, I think that's it from me.
Wow. Thanks, Carolina. That is, just a mind-boggling vision of what a modern organization and association look like. This sort of networked, overlapping set of institutions, breathtaking. Thank you, Carolina. And now I'd like to go over to Mamphela Ramphele, who's the co-president of the Club of Rome and the founder of Reimagine South Africa. Mamphela, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and I've enjoyed listening to my fellow panelists. I've come to transformative work from a very different angle. Growing up in apartheid South Africa, where as Black people, we were made to believe we were inferior, we were called non-whites, non-Europeans. So awakening to the power each human being has to self-liberation is what got us started in the late 60s. And this is how we build momentum by first liberating our own minds from inferiority complexes and challenging those who were white, male, dominant in positions of power to say that we are all human. At the end of the day, all human beings are part of the one human family. But what's needed is all of us have to reimagine anew what it means to be human. The three core elements of what it means to be human: human dignity of the self, and therefore being able to respect other people's dignity, fairness or social justice, and compassion. So we call it Ubuntu in my language, but at the end of the day, this is a common yearning at the heart of every human being. Now, is that base which enabled me later on, after 1994, when we have had a political settlement, to then transform the University of Cape Town, which was a white male college, to become a world-class African university, because it fancied itself as little Oxford that just happened to be in the Western Cape. And so that process of transforming institutions has to come from someone who is wrestling, because transformation doesn't happen as a once-off. It's a lifelong learning by doing and learning from mistakes and successes. And so as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, I was leading from my own example and also learning new things from an academic setting. And it is that which led to the idea when I saw that my country, despite having a fantastic constitutional democratic system, was not living up to the values of what it means to be human. And so Reimagine South Africa is a call for all South Africans to reimagine what a South Africa which lives by the values of Ubuntu could look like, how we could be more inclusive, how we can promote well-being for all, coming from the painful history of divisions and the fact that even today, 30 years after democracy, we are still the poster child for the most unequal society in the world. And that tells you that transformation doesn't happen as a once-off. It is a journey. And because in 1994, we didn't pay attention to dismantling the structural barriers to equality and equity and well-being for all, no amount of preaching about it by successive governments have made it happen. And so at the Club of Rome, the same thing. The Club of Rome is known for being really attentive to what the future will look like if we don't be sure that we lead in a way that promotes global equity for a healthy planet. And there as well, the focus has to start with people coming to terms with who they are. The Club of Rome is a predominantly white male organization. When I joined in 2018 as co-president with my co-president, Sandrine, we then worked to get the Club of Rome to recognize that if we are going to be effective change agents or catalysts for change towards this greater global equity for a healthy planet, we have to model it in terms of how we relate to one another, how we relate to the people who work with us, how we relate to other members, and also how we lead our lives. So for me, this is a challenge for humanity to keep returning to the essence of who we are. When we do that, we'll do what an indigenous leader in Australia said, that all human beings must become indigenous again. Then we'll be able to live in harmony with nature and with all other systems of life.
Thank you, Mamphela. I'm just reflecting on that. It was so rich. So I have a few questions I'd like to throw out. And I'll start with one panelist and then I'll open it up. And so if either of the other panelists feel inspired to or to say and to respond to what the first panelist raised or raise their own points, jump in then. Otherwise, we'll just go on to the next question. So the first question is about this idea of transformative initiative. So Derk, I'm going to start with you. So reflecting on what you said about your work with Drift, and then also thinking about what Mamphela said about reinventing the Club of Rome and the networked forms of the Global Regeneration Collab and other organizations that Carolina is involved in. What do you see here as sort of a common characteristic that you might say distinguishes a transformative initiative from a regular, everyday, conventional initiative?
Yes, so Mamphela's words are also still resonating with me. All humans need to learn to be indigenous again. I think that's a nice way to summarize the transformation that we need. What also resonated a lot is this idea that transformations are a lifelong journey that is embodied by people that are somehow feeling frustrated or have ideals or entrepreneurial or somehow feel that there are possibilities beyond the business as usual. And certainly the case in my situation. So within the context that you are rooted in, acknowledging the injustices and the unsustainabilities and the systemic flaws and the forces that try to hold it in place, is a starting point often for change makers to then start questioning that business as usual. We call it regime. Or inertia or path dependency, and create space for experimentation. I hesitate to say the word because people then think about pilots, but trying out things that might move us out of that lock-in. And I think for me, transformative work combines both. So a very critical, reflexive, systemic understanding of how historically we got into the current situation and what dominant, in our jargon, culture, structures and practices are that hold us in an undesirable state, and sort of a much more open-minded, humble, but very much empathic or engaged way of connecting to people that are already deviating from the norm or have been marginalized or practices that have been lost, and trying to figure out, okay, how can we make these more visible? How does it work? And asking these kind of questions that academics would say are research questions, formulating a hypothesis that on the long term they might accumulate to a radical systemic transformation, and then reflecting on what you learn and experience and then taking next steps. For me, those are the ingredients. So what makes an initiative or an act transformative is something that it can only be assessed in hindsight. Future historians might tell, but the ingredients are a very critical stance against what is unsustainable and unjust in the current state, and a very open, experimental and engaged way to explore potential alternatives to that.
Great. Thanks, sir. Carolina, does it resonate with you?
Absolutely. I think that I would summarize this as leading by example, which is such a simple expression. This openness that even if you don't have the answer, you do not know what this transformation, what this transformed world is going to look like, that together the participants of the members, participants, however you want to call it, of transformational organizations are trying together to figure out what better models would be and trying together, experimenting with them, and open to mistakes, open to actually communicating, okay, this did not work, we need to go back to the drawing board, we need to try something new, which I think that is what I think that's very important. People don't talk about mistakes that often. How do we learn from errors? How do we learn from what didn't work? How do we then also communicate what did work so that it can be scaled? So yeah, I don't have a lot to add. It was a great answer.
Yeah, that's a lot. Mamphela, in your work with Reimagine SA and Club of Rome, what have you seen that makes an organization a transformative one?
First of all, transformative organizations should be led in a value-based way. Second, those who are leading should create the spaces where people feel they have permission. The different views are welcome, so that we get into a mutually transformative engagement. And those engagements will involve co-reimagining what future do we want, co-creating processes that will lead us to that future, and being reflective and open to learning and acknowledging mistakes when they happen so that you can then learn from those mistakes. And so transformative institutions are not perfect institutions, but they're institutions that are willing to wrestle with the tensions and the contradictions of being human in a world which does not necessarily have or value transformative entities. They are seen as interrupting or disturbing, particularly in a world which is as unequal as we have today, or in a world that is committing suicide, as the UN Secretary General says, by doing things which we know are destructive of the planet. So when you are in that business of doing things which interfere with people's comforts, then you have to be, you have to fortify yourself by always reaffirming why you're doing what you're doing, and being reaffirmed and reinforced by working collaboratively with others.
Thank you, Mamphela. Well, that was some very stimulating and thought-provoking response. And I think that's a perfect moment to transition to our breakouts. So during this next section, in tables, and if you're sitting alone in a table, you could join another table that perhaps has two people in it. We'd like you by table to discuss 3 questions.
I'll take that on.
He'll take it, and he'll take it on, and I'll handle the back.
Yeah, there's
back
lots of things going on. We've got online, we've got multiple things happening. So I'm going to manage the room a little bit. So we're now going to go into a breakout. So we've heard some fantastic things from our panel that have got you thinking, hopefully. And I'd like to, in a moment, not just yet, but I'd like you to move into tables of about 4 or 5. Maximize people you don't know. So just you see it as another opportunity to get to know somebody else. And the questions are really simple. I haven't even put them down on here, but you might want to make a quick note of them. You might want to write these down, get down, keeps you focused anyway. You know, what transformational initiatives have you already been part of that you think are transformational? What enabled these initiatives to be transformational, in however you define it? And then how were challenges in the delivery of these initiatives overcome? So it's, what's your experience of transformational initiatives? What do you think makes them transformational for whoever is involved or whatever they're trying to do? And how were the challenges that you experienced overcome? So really just that sort of thing. We've only got about 15 minutes, so it's a really quick conversation. You won't have time to go around everybody. Maybe groups of 4 would be good. And then when we come after the discussion, I'm just going to draw maybe one really key point out of each group. So one main point that you might want to share with others, just very briefly, just something that came up that you thought was insightful, that either built on the panel or was something completely new. So I'm going to invite you to go into your breakout groups, just rearrange and have a good chat, and we'll see what comes up afterwards. Thank you. Great. So I think had a chance, the online breakout rooms have had a chance for a chat. Okay. Great, so we're going to have to relay a little bit back, but we've got a slight challenge with the mics, and I want to make sure that everybody online can hear. So I've decided that whoever's speaking back from your group, if you could come up, so maybe we could have one person from each of these 3 tables first, and just relate something back. And it's so we can stand next to the mic so the online people can hear. Otherwise, I'm going to have to paraphrase and repeat everything you're saying. So maybe we'll have one person from each of these 3 groups who'd like to come up, just to share one thing that you thought was particularly insightful or important that came out of your conversation, or that you enjoyed thinking about. So you 3 have got a minute to think about who's coming up. So who would like to come up? Okay, keep the car moving. We haven't got all day. Just somebody get up and move over. Maybe from another group if you're not ready yet. Perfect, 2 people, that'll do, that's a good start, thank you.
So when you have to stand?
Anyway, that's just the microphone anywhere there, and just share something with the group.
Yes, first
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
First I say thank you to the panel and your input. And hello, Mamphela, good friend from the Club of Rome and with perspective on Africa. I was sharing the experience of the transformation of the Moroccan education system for the last 4 years, and what made that transformation was to go with epistemic humility into it all, to grow a shared understanding of what is happening, what is and what could be, from co-reflected, lived experiences. And this is where Mamphela comes in, describing that circle, that safe and nourishing, love nurtured and love nourishing space as the most noble social technology that we have. And growing a shared understanding from co-reflection, not from individual expertise, brings us together in that nothing is more facilitating, and nothing is more facilitating for any kind of development or transformational process than a shared understanding of what is and what could be.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Round of applause for that.
Yeah, wonderful to hear that reflection. You can hear the voice of real transformation. We only covered the first question, and I think there were some common themes around if you set up a process that is inclusive, that is open space, that is also co-developed and co-produced, you end up, irrespective of the topic, whether it's food, whether it's degrowth, or whether it's culture, that's where transformation happens because of the way that you set the conditions up that make it more likely that a transformative change is likely to occur.
Brilliant, thank Thank you. Another round. Who else would like to share something? Great, thank you. And move this, it's a bit dangerous. Be okay. You just come and stand over here, yeah, it's this one here.
So the themes that came out in my group, we're talking a lot about creativity and creativity in places where maybe they're not used to seeing creativity, right? Like in academia and like in maybe city administrations, and coming out with new ways of doing things that open up spaces for people to think new things, do new things, and start on that transformative path. Also, the importance of dialogue and constant conversations, and the length of time and engagement that it takes, that you need to be talking to arrive at those compromises and new solutions that are needed. Humanity and putting people at the center of everything so that it's very human-led. And then the structural reforms, making structural changes for those long-term, so it's not a one-off, so that you're actually building the structure and systemic changes for that to be a long-term solution.
A lot of commonality already coming out around these, or at least complementarity as well. That's great, thanks.
Yeah. Here's good. Okay. So we had lots of different examples, and things that we talked about were enabling factors. And one thing that was quite obvious is resources. And the interesting thing here is, like, we had two resources that we discussed. One is legitimacy, so that you are actually enabled and allowed to do something different, something potentially transformative. And the other was funding. And this, which is very obvious, but at the same time, both of them come with this issue of, well, strings attached. So if you actually have legitimacy to try to do something transformative, like if you're a researcher, already you're part of the power game, you're part of representing something, there's a status involved. So how much could you actually transform the system while you are given the position to change it? It's kind of like, what is it limiting at the same time that you have these resources? And the same with funding. Like, if you have funds, if you have money to try out something different, how much would you actually want to change the system? So,
and we kind of add on that, like the enabling factors of creating a culture of transformation, one that's actually open to change, open to diverse perspectives, that's willing to engage with different communities and voices, and allow that not just to be sort of as part of this token participatory models, but something that's actually helping to drive forward your decision-making and action initiatives. And part of that is also designing the structures within your institutions or organizations that facilitate things like distributed resources across communities, that allows things like reciprocity and regenerative models to really come into play inside of the institutions or organizations, that allows people to have access and to actually bring into creativity, as others were talking about, rather than creating sort of these silos that are really built on sort of the age-old models that allow very limited abilities to innovate and create new opportunities for engaging with different perspectives. So,
great, thank you. Thank you. At the moment, I'm going to ask if there's anybody online in there who wants to share anything, but is there anybody else from this room who'd like to? Yeah, perfect, great, who would like to come over. So I'm going to go to online in a minute, and then we're going to go back to the panel. So see how that goes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Douglas. I'm representing the group back there with Marta, Guido, and Nikolai. Thanks for the good conversation. Of the group, the three colleagues back there are all in the sort of research space, and I'm in the practitioner space. So the first question, they were sort of like, have we been a part of transformative initiatives? Maybe, sort of, and definitely from the CLI, the Collective Leadership Institute perspective, the answer is yes. That's what we kind of do on the day-to-day. You know, we're in transformative initiatives trying to foster transformation. So we had an interesting conversation. I thought that when we went to the second question about sort of what made the things transformative, and the words that came out from my colleagues were sort of emancipatory and agency, sharing with people, crafting alliances, dialogue, and values, which also very much speaks to the approach that my institute uses. We sort of base our work on aliveness theory and how to craft or create ecosystems of collaboration. So very much sort of metaphor that I was using about collaboration ecosystems is like we try to plant seeds within the systems, not when we're invited into structures or systems, not to sort of go in and try and change those systems, but to allow the seeds of transformation to grow within individuals within those systems, and then they can then decide if they want to change systems or structures on their own. We also had an interesting perspective about the sort of challenges. And one of the challenges was mentioned was the sort of time-boundedness of the research or research projects. And actually on the other side, I think that's really important from our perspective at the CLI, is that we have a specific period of time in which to plant these seeds and hope that they will take root, that the roots will grow together, and that also that the buds will start to spring out of the ground, but that also that we can then feel confident in stepping away from those systems, having left enough transformative capacity within those systems that they will be sustainable and continue to grow on their own.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Let's go to the online, and I think the best way forward is you're probably just going to, if there's somebody online who wants to say something, you have to jump in or wave profusely. I can't see everybody at the moment, so online, but if anybody would like to share, switch your mic on and dive in. We'd love to hear from somebody online if we can. That's not the panel. Looks like, yeah, I can see, is that Rebecca Paul? Maybe, yeah, come in, you're smiling.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. In fact, we had a very good discussions in our group that we very much discussed that.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, just speak up a bit more, a bit louder.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you. In fact, we shared that how that traditionally the organizations work and the transformation they need, that organizations very much look into the traditional thinking, and they need very much think out of the box, and that needs the good leadership and collaboration, and particularly that the actors who are working in the section in the area, that they need very effective engagement and networking and the regulatory changes. And also we looked into that the governance, particularly the lack of information, how this flows, and also the delegating the responsibilities to the downward staffs. Not the leaders take the all responsibilities. So, and leaders' attitude and transformative leadership is very important for transformation of such transformative organizations that we are talking about.
Great, so a whole range of combination of things, networking, governance, leadership, a whole bunch of things need to come together for transformation to happen. That's brilliant. Let's just see if there's anybody else online. Do we have one more person online that would like to jump in and share something? This is your opportunity for fame in the front of everybody else. Oh, nobody. Oh, Peter. Maybe Peter wants to come in. Yeah, come in, Peter.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Maybe just to share a couple reflections from our work on Burning Man. Some of the cores there relative to the empirical transformative outcomes in the event are a sense of purpose and civic responsibility, combined with a culture of yes and, like in improv, we don't say no you can't. We just add to it and build on what people are working on together. There's responsibility, there's that sense of yes, there's a culture of joy and imagination. And all of that together, if you provide a container that's safe, but not too safe to explore that, and for people to really reach into themselves and to bring out the stuff that really makes them sing, and to do it in a way that it can really be applied in the world, that's where the magic happens.
That's wonderful. Yes, and joy and imagination. I can work with that. I did say no though to Bruce when he wanted to add another layer of technological complexity onto this, and I said no, that's too much. So yes, and joy and imagination. Wonderful. Okay, that's great. So what we're going to do now is going to go back to the panel for some of their reflections. So I'm going to hand back over to Bruce, to lead the next part of the conversation around that. But before we finish, I'd just like to give a round of applause for everybody's thoughts and contributions so far. Celebration is always good. Over to you, Bruce.
Yes. So one last question that relates to the interest that we have as a community to enable one another's projects and initiatives and organizations and networks and learning labs and all the things that we're doing that we might call transformations initiatives to thrive. The transformations community would like to be a kind of meta organization helping other organizations thrive among our membership. So the question is, what kind of skills or capacities or resources should we be cultivating among our membership to enable them to better design and build and manage more durable and effective transformations organizations? You know, what is it that we need as a community? Or what kind of, and how could we provide those opportunities to our membership? And so, given the panelists' experience with these organizations and with working with people, other transformations agents, as they, struggle to make these initiatives successful, what do you think we need to invest in as a community, as a collective, to enable us to do this work better, to do the work of, not the work of transformations, but the work of supporting transformations initiatives? And so, Derk, given your experience with Drift over the years, what do you think we need as folks who generally aren't trained in this kind of work, generally are more trained as transformations researchers and practitioners and doing work in the field with communities? What do we need to create and sustain these powerful transformative institutions? Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I might reconsider what I'm going to say next after some of the inputs Caroline and Mamphela gave in the short breakout we had. We discussed a lot about activism and also resistance against forces to liberate people from an oppressive or unsustainable regime, and strategies to dismantle or diffuse that need to somehow be combined with building up the alternatives. So I think from our perspective, it's not like individuals can hold all these capacities. So if we think about transformative capacities, they are always a collective property of a network or of a collective. And we try to translate our experiences with transition, governance, action research, social learning and transformative education into a new master program where we which we focused on developing 4 capacities. Think, so the ability to take a step back and to understand systemic patterns, lock-ins and path dependencies, so to bridge different types of knowledges to come to a new analytical understanding of the present and the transformative needs and potential. Second capacity is connect. So the ability to work across boundaries of organizations, disciplines, backgrounds, cultural differences. So to be able to find and identify like-minded people, but also to work with a diversity of people. The third capacity is act. So the ability to take action, even if it is on a small scale, and to learn from it. So transformative action is always an experimental praxis, and especially academics are unlearning that skill in our universities. So it's not senseless doing, but it's doing while thinking and thinking while doing. And the fourth capacity is, we call it reflect. So the ability to also reflect on your own position and on what is happening, on the indirect impacts of your interventions, and to be reflexive. So for us, it's think, connect, act, reflect. Those are the 4 capacities we identified.
Thanks, sir. Carolina, over to you.
Okay, I have 3 practical things that I think are really important and that in general, these types of initiatives could use help with. So one of them is awareness and information. And this, I'll bring up mapping, and I know that there's a session on this later. For example, for the transformations community right now, right here, I don't know who's in the room. There's, I don't know, maybe 30 people. I'm not sure if this is a good estimate here, but I don't know who's here. I don't know what most of you are working on, which organizations you're affiliated with, what your skill sets are. So maybe I'm actually looking to collaborate with some of you, but I just don't know that you are the people I'm looking for. So this is super important. If there is a way to map, this is the best possible way. And I would like to bring an example. So in Lisbon recently with Refi Lisboa, we used this great platform called Catalyst, which we put in the hands of a group of 30 to 40 people. And in half an hour, we had 40 points on the map of regenerative projects around the city. No one asked any questions on how to use it. And this platform has interoperability with other maps of regeneration, systems change. So these points are gonna move. Other people are gonna be able to see them. And it's also open source. So anyone can now see the information. Everyone contributed, everyone can use it, and everyone can use it to find others. Second thing would be governance. So a lot of the problem that I see in self-organizing is that people get excited, they jump into a project, and then after a while they're butting heads because they didn't think through the vision initially, they didn't think through how they were going to organize things, and then suddenly they're in conflict. And then they need someone to step in, and sometimes this kills the project. So having a repository of, and maybe this actually already exists, the point of mapping, but governance templates for self-organizing, for transformation organizations. What are different formats and things that people are using? And finally, funding. Networks are so difficult to fund, and many times it's not even about funding the network itself. It's about that we see a need from the projects in the network to gain small amounts of funding. For example, in the GRC, we had a certain point where someone in East Africa needed a printer for the permaculture education materials for the refugee camp, and someone actually helped him. But now there are others needing videography material, needing to buy gardening materials, and these aren't things you can get through a grant. So how can we enable, and are there models already out there where networks can receive funding to then disperse to the members, basically, so that they don't have to go through all of these loopholes and then end up investing all this time for grants that they will never get, basically. Can we, yeah, so I think research can help a lot with that.
Thanks. Mamphela, over to you.
This has been a very rich conversation, and I believe that we live in a world where one of the most scarce resources is time. People feel stretched. So I believe the first effort of investment should go into investing time for conversations and check-ins at the beginning of each day. The team can then be able to size us out who's in a good or bad space and how can we support that person. Second, change the narratives of competition, even amongst change makers or transformative institutions. The competition for scarce resources undermines the possibilities of collaboration and collective action. Also, change the narrative from scarcity to abundance, because ultimately, if we pool our resources, we'll have more to accomplish what we need to accomplish and to learn from one another, so that we are not all experimenting with things that may have been experimented with before. And my final point is about how we need to translate what we say we believe in into the changing of structures and systems. And I, as someone who's been tied to academic institutions for quite a long time, it's shocking to me that we are still teaching economics 101 the way it was taught 30 years ago. It's shocking that we are still teaching finance the way we are teaching it. I count all of these things that we know are not designed to promote global equity for a healthy planet. It's like we are on a treadmill. So I really want to make an appeal for those of you who are in academia, in research institutions, find ways of learning and teaching differently so that we can begin to enlarge the circles of those who are transformative agents around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that is the end of our session. And what a rich session it was. It is a perfect beginning, I think, to the exploration that we're undertaking in a series of these sessions at this conference. We're about to go in our next block of sessions. We have two panels. One of them is on systems mapping and visioning. And not just as a intellectual tool, as a way of understanding systems conceptually or solely analytically, but really as a way of engaging communities, and also engaging political stakeholders, engaging diversity of knowledge holders. How do you do these kinds of complex visioning and mapping exercises and identifying leverage points, seeking to identify alternative futures in collaboration with communities in a way that's impactful and not just interesting, but actually is going to motivate collective action and enable this mapping and visioning effort to be a living process that's embedded within the community. So that's an issue that really relates closely to this panel in the sense that you need a transformations initiatives to hold that process, the analytical process. And what does that look like? How can we do this in a way that's durable and lasting, that engages people and addresses power inequalities in communities? It's not just a conceptual problem. We also have another panel looking at the Living Libraries Project. Joel Onyango is going to talk about his work in Kenya to incorporate different kinds of knowledge practitioners into the work of his organization. How do you move beyond knowledge with all of its Western bias, with all of its groundedness in the post-colonial institutions, such as academies of science in the Western world? How do you bring other kinds of knowledge in association with that knowledge in ways that is giving them the appropriate weight for the decisions that people need to make in their own interests, in their own communities? So Joel has some really interesting innovations that he's developed in that setting, with his organization being the sort of envelope, the support for this process over time, for incorporating and bringing in people to serve as living libraries. So I look forward to the conversation to continue. And really want to thank our panelists, Carolina, Derk, and Mamphela, for an intriguing and engaging discussion, and want to give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thank our online participants for being a part of this. And of course, this conversation with the rest of them that are being filmed in a hybrid format will be available for review. And I know I want to go back in and listen again to some of those statements that are made to capture them completely. So that opportunity will be available within 24 hours and for the next few months. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.